Hey, welcome back to the Potter Show. We've got something fire today. Harry walked into Gringotts age 6 and asked, "Why did Dumbledore take 52 items from my parents' grave?" Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1. The Ledger. The dream came again on a Tuesday. Harry knew it was Tuesday because Vernon had cursed at the television the night before about some football match being on a Monday, which meant the next morning was Tuesday, which meant Dudley had swimming lessons and the house would be quieter than usual for exactly 3 hours. Harry had learned to track time by the spaces between other people's routines. It was the kind of skill you picked up when your own schedule didn't exist. In the dream there was a hallway, long and marble-floored and lit by something that wasn't fire and wasn't electric light, but something older than both. The walls were lined with doors, and behind one of them, always the same one, always the third on the left, there was a sound like paper turning, like someone reading, like someone waiting. Harry always woke up before he reached it. This time he'd gotten close enough to see that the door had a number on it. Not a room number, a number like an accounting entry, like a ledger line, 52. He lay in his cupboard for a long time after he woke, staring at the slanted ceiling with the spider in the corner he'd named Gerald. Gerald was spinning something. Harry watched him work and thought about the number and thought about the hallway and thought about the word that had come with it this time, spoken in a voice that wasn't any voice he recognized but felt familiar the way old wood smells familiar. Gringotts. He knew the word. He'd heard it once when Vernon had been on the phone with someone from work, complaining about exchange rates, and he'd said those Gringotts people have their fingers in everything. Harry had filed the word away without knowing why. He filed a lot of things away. The cupboard under the stairs had very little in it besides a cot, a broken torch, and Harry's collection of filed away things. He got up. He dressed in Dudley's cast-offs, a shirt so large it fell past his hips, trainers 2 sizes too big stuffed with newspaper at the toes. He ate the half slice of toast Petunia left on the counter without comment, drank a glass of water from the tap, and walked out the front door. Petunia was in the back garden. He could hear her talking to Mrs. Next Door about begonias. He walked to the end of Privet Drive and turned left. He was 6 years old and small for it, and London was enormous in the way that cities are enormous when you're not quite sure how they work yet. But Harry had a sense of direction that had nothing to do with road signs. It was the same thing that sometimes made lights flicker when he was angry, or made his hair grow back overnight after Petunia took the kitchen scissors to it, or made the glass of the snake enclosure at the zoo dissolve completely that one time last summer, though he'd never told anyone about that because the look on the snake's face as it slid away had been so deeply satisfied that Harry felt it deserved its privacy. He took the tube. He had exactly £1.40 that he'd collected over 3 months from the gap between the sofa cushions, dropped coins in the Tesco car park, and one lucky find in the gutter outside the post office. It was enough for a Zone 1 fare if he went through the children's gate, which he did, following a woman with a pushchair so closely that the attendant assumed he was hers. He got off at the stop that felt right, came up the stairs into daylight and stopped. The street was busy, normal London busy, taxis and buses and tourists with maps and office workers with coffees. But Harry was looking at something else. There was a building between a bookshop and a record store that he was absolutely certain had not been there a moment ago. It was narrow and white and very, very tall, and 2 beings stood outside it that were not human. They were shorter than most adults, much shorter actually, but there was nothing small about the way they stood. They had long, clever faces and eyes that caught the light oddly, and hands that Harry instinctively understood were very capable of doing damage if called upon to do so. They wore uniforms that looked ceremonial in the way that sharp things look ceremonial, technically decorative, but clearly functional. Harry walked up to them. One of them looked down. The look was not hostile. It was assessing, the way you'd assess a package you weren't expecting that had arrived on your doorstep and might contain something important or might contain a live animal. Harry was used to being assessed. He stood still and let it happen. "Harry Potter," the goblin said, not a question. "Yes," Harry said. "Is this Gringotts?" "It is." "I need to speak to someone about my parents' account." He decided on this phrasing on the tube. It was specific without being specific enough to be wrong. The 2 goblins exchanged a look so fast and so layered it was practically a conversation. Then the one on the left, taller by an inch, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, stepped aside and pulled the bronze door open. "Phileas Crack will see you," he said. Harry had not asked for Phileas Crack, but he nodded as though he had and walked in. The inside of Gringotts was the hallway from his dream. Not exactly, the floor was white marble here instead of grey, and the light came from chandeliers rather than the sourceless glow in his sleeping mind, but the feeling was identical. The sound of quills on parchment, the smell of old metal and deep earth, the sense of a place that had been doing something very specific for a very long time and was entirely uninterested in your opinion about it. Harry walked slowly, looking at everything. He had his hands in the pockets of his overlarge trousers because he wasn't sure what to do with them, and standing with your hands visible felt like a different kind of thing in here. The goblins at the long counter did not look at him the way people usually looked at him. They looked at him the way they looked at everyone, with a flat professional interest that was actually much more respectful than the pity or the irritation or the studied blankness he usually got. Harry found he liked it. A goblin appeared at his elbow. This one was older, with fingers so long they looked almost architectural, and spectacles balanced on a nose that had seen considerable history. He looked at Harry the way the dream door had felt, like recognition. "Phileas Crack," the goblin said, and bowed, not deeply, precisely. Harry bowed back, same angle, he wasn't sure why, but it seemed right. "Harry Potter, you have come about your family's account." Yes, Harry followed him around the edge of the Great Hall, past counters and queues and goblins doing complicated things with very old money, through a door that required 2 keys turned simultaneously, down a corridor that smelled of stone and old contracts, and into an office that was filled from floor to ceiling with ledgers. The chair Phileas Crack gestured to was sized for an adult, so Harry's feet didn't touch the ground. He sat with his back straight anyway. He'd learned that touching the floor was optional, but sitting straight was not. "You called me," Harry said. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the same way he might say it's raining. A fact offered for confirmation. Phileas Crack settled behind the enormous desk and folded his long hands together. "I sent a nudge through a channel that has been open between this bank and the Potter heir for 6 years, maintained in the hope that someone would eventually find themselves here." He paused. "I did not expect it to be you yourself. I expected a solicitor, a guardian, someone acting on your behalf." "I don't have a guardian," Harry said, "not a real one." "No," Phileas Crack agreed, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite pity and was not quite anger, but was some precise intersection of both. "You do not. That is, in fact, one of the reasons you needed to come. Tell me about my parents' account," Harry said. Phileas Crack looked at him for a long moment. "How much do you know?" "They died when I was 1. A wizard named Voldemort killed them. I was sent to live with my mother's sister." Harry said all of this the way you'd read a list. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered enormously, actually, somewhere in the part of him that existed below words, but because he had learned that if you said the hard things neutrally, people gave you more information than if you cried. "I had a dream about this building, a door with the number 52 and a word." He looked at Phileas Crack steadily. "What does 52 mean?" The goblin was quiet for 3 seconds. Harry counted. Then Phileas Crack stood, went to the shelves, and removed a ledger so large it required both hands. He set it on the desk and opened it to a page marked with a strip of dark ribbon. He turned it so Harry could see. The page was dense with entries, names of items, dates, reference numbers, the cramped official handwriting of someone documenting things they expected never to be questioned about. Harry leaned forward and read carefully. He was a good reader. He'd learned from Dudley's discarded books before starting school, because the school library was something he'd been allowed to use even when other things weren't available to him, and reading had become the private territory that nobody had thought to restrict. He read for a long time. Phileas Crack let him. The items were listed under a heading that read, Potter Estate, items removed per order of APWB. Dumbledore, November 3rd, 1981, 2 days after his parents died. The list ran down the page and onto the next. Books, journals, a family pensive. A set of wardenship rings, investment portfolios, a deed of property, a sealed letter addressed to Harry when you're ready. A woman's personal grimoire with a note in the margin of the registry, LJP, personal magical research, value incalculable. 52 items, documented one by one, removed from the Potter family vault and placed in a secondary holding account registered to the office of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore for the protection and management of the Potter estate. Harry read the heading 3 times. He took them, Harry said. Yes, 2 days after they died. Yes, Harry sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the way the lamp in the corner threw the shadows of the ledger shelves up against the stone in long parallel lines, like bars. Then he looked back at Phileas Crack. "Why did Dumbledore take 52 items from my parents' grave?" he asked. And the question sat in the air between them with a weight that had been building for 6 years, ever since that November, ever since a baby in a crib survived something that shouldn't have been survivable, and was subsequently handed to relatives who didn't want him and stripped of everything that should have been his. Phileas Crack leaned forward. His voice was very even. "That is the precise question this bank has been waiting for someone to ask." It took 2 hours to go through the full scope of it. Phileas Crack did not speak in information dumps. He was a professional. He presented evidence the way a craftsman presents work, methodically, with respect for the material. He showed Harry the original Potter vaults, intact as of October 31st, 1981. He showed him the removal orders, each stamped with Dumbledore's personal seal. He showed him the secondary account, which had technically been maintained with the minimum legal transparency requirements, meaning Gringotts knew everything but could not act without someone with claim to the Potter estate formally requesting an audit. "Why didn't you tell someone before now?" Harry asked halfway through because it seemed like a fair question. "We sent notifications," Phileas Crack said without defensiveness, 3 in the first year to the Ministry of Magic's Office of Wizarding Affairs. One directly to Albus Dumbledore, requesting documentation of authorization, one to the Potter family solicitor. He paused. The first 3 were marked, received and filed. The 4th was responded to with a document authorizing the arrangement that was signed by Albus Dumbledore, a very slight pause, authorizing himself and the solicitor. Retired abruptly in December of 1981 and emigrated to Portugal. Harry absorbed this. He was thinking about the letter on the list, "Harry, when you're ready," in his father's handwriting according to the registry note. He was thinking about his mother's grimoire, her personal magical research, which she would have spent years filling. He was thinking about 2 dead people who had left things for their son, and a man who had arrived 2 days after their deaths and quietly taken them. "He thought I'd never find out," Harry said, not bitterly, just following the logic to its end. "He believed you would arrive at Hogwarts at 11 years old, knowing only what he chose to tell you," Phileas Crack said. "Grateful for his guidance, dependent on his goodwill, unaware of your own assets, your own history, or your own legal standing." Harry thought about that. He thought about it from the inside, being 11 years old and walking into a world you knew nothing about, and someone stepping forward to be your guide, your protector, the person who knew everything and would tell you what you needed to know when you needed to know it. He thought about how that would feel, how safe it would seem. He thought about how completely you'd trust someone in that position. "What can I do?" Harry asked. "Right now I'm 6, I know there are laws about age and property and things like that. But what can I actually do today in this room legally?" Phileas Crack looked at him the way the goblin at the door had looked at him, that precise, unpacking assessment. Then the old goblin did something Harry hadn't seen him do yet. He smiled. It was not a warm smile in the human sense. It was the smile of someone who had been doing an unpleasant job for 40 years and had just discovered there was going to be a satisfying ending after all. "Under the Goblin Wizard Accord of 1397, Phileas Crack said, reaching for a different ledger entirely, which predates the current Ministry of Magic by nearly 3 centuries and supersedes ministry family law in matters of estate protection. A recognized magical heir of majority bloodline can invoke claimant parentage at any age if they can demonstrate awareness and intent. What does that do? It formally designates Gringotts as magical guardian of your estate, bypassing any external management arrangement until such time as you reach magical majority. It freezes the secondary account. It triggers a mandatory audit that neither the ministry nor any private individual can halt or delay." Phileas Crack folded his hands. "And it formally establishes you as heir apparent to the Potter lordship, which means any legal action taken against your estate, past or present, must be answered before the full Wisengamot. Public?" Harry asked. "Very." Harry thought about this for a full minute. He could hear the bank beyond the office walls, the distant sound of vaults and transactions, and the ordinary business of a world he was just beginning to understand. He thought about Dumbledore, who he'd never met but who had apparently been making decisions about his life since before he could walk. He thought about the letter his father had written him, sitting in a secondary account unread. He thought about Gerald the spider, spinning in the dark of the cupboard under the stairs, working on something without any instruction because it was simply in his nature to do so. "Tell me exactly what I need to say," Harry said, "and where I need to put my hand." The ritual was not dramatic in the way Harry had half expected rituals to be. There was no flash of light, no booming voice, no sensation of ancient power flowing through him, or rather there was, but it felt less like lightning and more like a door closing firmly behind you. A click, a settling. The feeling of something that had been open for too long finally, properly shut. He pressed his right palm to a stone plate etched with the Gringotts seal and spoke the words Phileas Crack had shown him, written in English with goblin characters alongside, and he said them clearly and without stumbling because he'd read them twice and that was enough. "I am Harry James Potter, blood heir of the Potter line. I invoke claimant parentage under the Goblin Wizard Accord. I claim my estate, my legacy, and my right to account. Let Gringotts bear witness and act accordingly." The stone plate warmed under his hand, not uncomfortably, like someone placing their palm against yours. Then it was done. Phileas Crack produced a scroll so thick it had to be bound with 2 ribbons and set it on the table between them. "This is your copy of the invocation, guard it." Harry picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, which felt appropriate. "What happens now?" "Now," Phileas Crack said, "we send notices to the ministry, to Albus Dumbledore, to every member of the Wisengamot with an interest in estate law. And we begin the formal audit." He leaned back. "This will not be quiet, I want you to understand that. What you have done today cannot be undone, and the people who preferred you not to do it will not be pleased. Good, Harry said. Phileas Crack looked at him. You are 6 years old. I know. Harry looked back steady. Does that change what's in the ledger? No. Does it change what he took? No. Then it doesn't really change anything important, does it? Another one of those assessing pauses. Then Phileas Crack did something else Harry hadn't expected. He reached into the drawer of his desk and produced a small card, stiff, cream-colored, engraved with goblin script, and in the corner in English a name and a title. Ragnarok. Director, Gringotts Bank, London. He will want to meet you, Phileas Crack said. Not today, but soon. He has his own history with this matter. A pause. Do not be alarmed by him, he is direct. That's fine, Harry said. I prefer it. He put the card in his pocket alongside his remaining 30 pence, and the scroll went under his arm, and he stood up and offered Phileas Crack his hand, and the goblin shook it with the same precise formality as the bow, not servile, not hierarchical, but equal, honest. How do I come back? Harry asked. I live with the Dursleys. I can't exactly. A Gringotts access token, Phileas Crack said, and produced a small coin, not gold, not silver, some darker metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Keep it on your person. When you need to come, hold it and think of this office. You will find your way. Harry turned the coin over in his fingers. It was warm like the stone plate. Like the door clicking shut, like something that was his. He tucked it into the front pocket of the overlarge shirt against his chest and felt it settle there. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me, Phileas Crack said, and there was something in the old goblin's voice that was very human and very old and not unkind. Thank the accord. Thank the 60 years of paperwork that your family's solicitor filed before he fled to Portugal. Thank your father, who registered your blood claim at your birth in anticipation of exactly this kind of situation, because James Potter was a paranoid man about certain things. He paused. And perhaps thank whatever it was that made you dream of us. Harry nodded once. He picked up the scroll. And he walked out. The afternoon had turned golden by the time he came through the front doors of Gringotts onto the street, and London was doing its early evening transformation from purposeful to leisurely. The bronze doors closed behind him with a sound like a book being shut. Harry stood on the pavement and breathed in bus exhaust and late summer warmth and felt, for the first time in 6 years, like the ground was under his feet instead of shifting. He didn't have a specific emotion about what had just happened. That would come later, in pieces, the grief of reading his father's name on the removal order, the cold particular anger of the grimoire entry, the exhausted tenderness of knowing his father had registered his blood claim at birth like a letter written in advance to a child he hoped would never need it. All of that was going to land eventually, in the dark of the cupboard, with Gerald spinning above him. Right now he was just hungry and needed the tube back to Little Winging before anyone noticed he was gone. He was 3 steps toward the station when a voice said, "Excuse me." He turned. A woman was standing on the pavement behind him, older, severe-looking, with iron-grey hair pulled back and a coat that was slightly wrong for the weather in a way that suggested she was dressed for a different world. She was looking at him with an expression that was doing battle with itself, caught between several different things that wanted to be said simultaneously. Harry looked at her. "You're him," she said. Her voice was Scottish and controlled and only slightly shaken. "You're Harry Potter." He didn't confirm or deny. "Can I help you?" She stared at him. He understood distantly that a 6-year-old boy standing on the pavement outside Gringotts with a scroll under his arm and an expression of complete composure was not what she had expected. He didn't know who she was, but she clearly knew who he was, and the way she was looking at him had something in it that Petunia's face never did, not quite guilt, but the ancestor of it. "I'm Minerva McGonagall," she said. "I teach at—" "I know what Hogwarts is," Harry said, because he did, because Phileas Crack had mentioned it twice in passing and he'd filed it. "I'll be attending in 5 years." McGonagall's mouth opened, then closed. "Are you going to tell someone you saw me here?" Harry asked, not confrontationally. Genuinely curious about the answer. She stopped. She looked at the scroll, then at his face, then at the scroll again. "What have you done in there?" Harry considered her. She seemed distressed in a way that was internally focused, not externally threatening. Like someone who had just been forced to see something they'd been managing not to see. "Nothing that wasn't mine to do," he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, and he meant it genuinely because she seemed like she might not be. Something flickered across her face, surprise mostly at being asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. Harry nodded. He understood not knowing. He took 52 things, he said, and he watched her face to see if she already knew. He needed to know if she was someone who had looked away on purpose. The way the color left her face told him she had not known. Not specifically, not like that, not with a number attached. She had perhaps known in the way you know things you've decided not to examine too closely, a shape in the peripheral, a discomfort you've learned to step over, but the number, the specificity, the 52. That she had not known, "From your parents' vault," she whispered. "November 3rd, 1981, Harry said, 2 days after." McGonagall looked like she'd been struck somewhere below the sternum. She reached out and put her hand on the wall of the building beside her, steadying herself, which Harry thought was an honest reaction, and he gave her credit for it. He had things to do. He had to get home before Vernon started looking for reasons to be angry. But he stood on the pavement for another moment and let her have the weight of it, because it was a heavy thing and she had clearly only just picked it up. When it becomes public, Harry said, and it might be good to have already decided where you stand. He didn't say it as a threat, he didn't need to. He said it the same way Phileas Crack had said things, as information offered without pressure for the recipient to do with what they would. Then he shifted the scroll under his arm, turned up the collar of Dudley's too large shirt against the evening chill, and walked toward the tube. He didn't look back, but he heard her voice once more, very quiet, aimed mostly at herself. "Oh, Albus," she said, and there was a lifetime of complicated things in those two words. Harry kept walking. He got back to Privet Drive at 7:43, slipped in through the kitchen window he'd left unlatched, and was sitting at the table drinking a glass of water when Petunia came in from the garden. She looked at him, then at the oversized scroll on the table, then at him again. "Where have you been?" she said, and her voice had the sharpness of suppressed fear rather than genuine anger. He recognized the difference. "London," he said. Her face did something complicated. Petunia's face, Harry had noticed, was always doing something complicated when it involved him. She was not a kind woman, and she was not a cruel one. She was a frightened woman who had loved her sister and hated what her sister's world had done to her life, and Harry had been deposited on her doorstep as a walking summary of everything she'd rather not think about. He almost felt sorry for her on good days. "London," she repeated. "I'll be going again," he said, "regularly probably. For things to do with my parents' estate." He watched her. "You probably shouldn't mention it to Vernon." Petunia stared at him for a long moment, at his messy hair, at his overlarge clothes, at the 6-year-old face wearing an expression that she had no framework for in a 6-year-old. Then she looked at the scroll with its 2 ribbons and the Gringotts seal pressed into the wax. "Your mother," she started and then stopped. "She'd have done the same," Harry said gently, "wouldn't she?" Petunia's mouth pressed into a thin line that was hiding something much softer. She looked away, out the kitchen window at the perfectly normal garden in the perfectly normal street, and for just a moment she wasn't the woman who gave Harry cast-off clothes and grudging meals. She was a girl who had watched her extraordinary sister walk into a world that hadn't wanted her and hadn't come back. "I won't mention it to Vernon," she said stiffly and left the room. Harry finished his water. He took the scroll and the Gringotts coin and the card with Ragnar's name on it and went to his cupboard. He set the scroll under the thin mattress where he kept the things he needed to keep safe. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. Gerald had finished whatever he was spinning. The web was perfect, geometric and deliberate, and exactly what it was supposed to be. Harry closed his eyes. The hallway in his dream wasn't there tonight. Instead there was light, the warm, sourceless light from behind the door spreading out under it and through it, filling the space with gold. And in the gold were voices he didn't know yet but recognized. A woman's laugh, clear and warm, and a man's voice saying something he couldn't quite make out, but that had the unmistakable rhythm of someone reading aloud to someone they loved. He didn't try to reach the door, he didn't need to yet. He just let it be there, lit from the inside, waiting. He'd begun. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow he would think about the Wisengamot notices, about Ragnarok, about what happened next in the machinery he'd set in motion. Tomorrow he would think about 52 items, and what it meant to have a mother who'd filled a book with her own magic, and a father who'd written a letter he'd never gotten to send. Tonight he was 6 years old, and he'd ridden the London Underground alone, and walked into the most secure bank in the wizarding world, and invoked a 600-year-old treaty, and started something that a very powerful man was going to find impossible to stop. He thought that was probably enough for one Tuesday. 300 miles away, in an office at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a silver instrument on a desk began to move for the first time in 6 years. It was a small thing, delicate, spidery, a needle that tracked the status of a monitored account. It had been still since November 1981. Now it was spinning. Albus Dumbledore sat at his desk and looked at it for a very long time without speaking. Fawkes the Phoenix, perched on his stand by the window, turned his head and made a low sound that was not quite comfort. Dumbledore picked up a quill, set it down, picked it up again. Then he took a piece of parchment and wrote 3 words, underlined them twice, and sat looking at them in the candlelight with the expression of someone recalculating a very important sum. He knows already. Outside the window, the Scottish sky was the deep blue-black of a night with too many stars, and somewhere in England, a small boy with his mother's eyes and his father's nerve was sleeping soundly in a cupboard under some stairs, with a treaty scroll under his mattress and a coin against his chest that was still quietly warm. Chapter 2. The Potter Seat. 3 months passed. Harry spent them learning. Not school learning, though he was careful to keep that up, too careful to keep his marks exactly average, careful to neither shine nor fail, because standing out at school meant attention and attention at school meant Dudley, and Dudley meant complications. But after school, in the hours before Vernon came home, and the house locked itself into the performance of a normal family dinner, Harry read. Phileas Crack had sent books. Not all at once, they arrived one at a time, slipped through the kitchen letter slot in brown paper with no return address, as thin and unremarkable as catalogues. But the contents were not catalogues. They were introductions to wizarding lore, to the Wisengamot's structure and history, to the function of lordship seats and voting blocks and the old families who still wielded power through inheritance rather than election. Harry read each one the evening it arrived and filed everything away in the architecture of his memory, which was large and well organized, and getting more so by the week. He'd been to Gringotts 4 more times. Each time he'd held the coin against his chest on the tube, it had stopped being a conscious action. He held it the way you hold something that matters without thinking about why, and each time Phileas Crack had more to show him. The audit was progressing. The secondary account, frozen by the claimant parente's invocation, had been fully inventoried. The 52 items were catalogued and their locations confirmed, still in Dumbledore's private holding chamber within Gringotts, exactly where they'd been put in November of 1981, untouched, as though the man had taken them not to use them but simply to ensure Harry couldn't. That detail sat with Harry. He thought about it during the long, slow hours of weekend afternoons. You didn't take things to use them and then leave them in a box for 6 years. You took things to keep them from someone. That was a different category of action. It told you something different about the person who'd done it. He also met Ragnok. That happened on the 4th visit, in a different office, deeper in the building, downstairs that descended at an angle that suggested they were getting into the bones of London itself. Ragnok's office was large by goblin standards, which meant it was the size of a respectable broom cupboard, but it was entirely filled with the weight of the man in it. Ragnok was old, ancient maybe, in the way that things which have seen a great deal become hard to date by looking at. He had none of Phileas Crack's careful presentation. He sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface and looked at Harry the way you'd look at a weapon someone had handed you that you weren't sure yet how to hold. "You're small," Ragnok said. "You're short," Harry said. A pause, then from somewhere deep in the goblin's chest, a sound like a large boulder being dragged across stone, which turned out to be laughter. "Phileas Crack was right about you," Ragnok said. "Sit down." Harry sat. "You know why I care about this," Ragnok said. It wasn't a question, but it was an invitation to say what you knew, and Harry had learned that when someone offered you that kind of invitation, you should accept it. It showed you'd been paying attention, and Ragnok was the kind of person who wanted to know if you'd been paying attention. "The Accord of 1397, Harry said. "Dumbledore's office requested access to a restricted section of the Gringotts Historical Archives in 1973. The request was denied. In 1975, those same archives were broken into. Nothing was taken, but several documents related to the original Accord negotiations were photographed, probably, or copied by hand. You've never been able to prove it was him." Harry paused. "But you know it was." Ragnok was very still. "Phileas Crack didn't tell you that?" "No." Harry had found it in one of the law books, in a footnote in a chapter about banking security, the kind of footnote that someone had written carefully enough to be accurate without being obvious about what it was. He copied the Accord to find out its limits, what it would and wouldn't protect. He's been using that knowledge ever since to walk exactly along the edges of what the Accord technically allows. The violation of your family's estate is inside the edges technically, which is why he did it through Gringotts rather than around it. He knew you couldn't act without a claimant." Harry looked at Ragnok steadily. He knew there was no claimant. "He made sure of that by putting me with people who had no idea any of this existed." Ragnok looked at him for a long moment, then he said, "He underestimated the Potter paranoia. Dad registered my blood claim at birth. James Potter registered about 14 things at your birth that nobody else registers, because nobody else is quite so thoroughly convinced their family is being watched." Something moved in Ragnok's expression that was almost fond, filtered through about 40 years of professional distance. "He was annoying about it, actually. The paperwork was considerable." Harry smiled. He hadn't expected to smile thinking about his father, but there it was, small and real, sliding out before he could organize it away. He let it stay. "The Wisengamot filing," Harry said, getting back to business. "When we file at the end of the month." Ragnok's hands pressed flat on the desk. "The hearing will be scheduled within 60 days of filing. It will be public. The Potter estate violations will be read into the official record, and every sitting member of the Wisengamot will receive a copy of the audit report." He paused. "Dumbledore is the chief warlock. He chairs the Wisengamot. He'll have to sit and listen to it," Harry said. "He will be unable to refuse. The mechanism we're using, the Estate Grievance Clause of 1612, predates his chairmanship. He cannot close the session, delay it, or remove himself from the chair without the consent of 2/3 of the membership. Ragnar's expression was doing something with its corners that was probably satisfaction. "I have spent 30 years waiting for someone with standing to invoke that clause. Then let's not waste it," Harry said. The notice arrived at Hogwarts on a grey November morning. Dumbledore was having breakfast when the owl came, not the school post, which came at 8, but a Gringotts courier, black-feathered and cold-eyed, carrying a sealed scroll with the bank's full ceremonial seal in red wax. He opened it at the table, which was the first mistake, because Minerva McGonagall was sitting 2 seats away, and she had been, for the past 3 months, watching him with an expression he hadn't been able to fully read. He read the filing notice, then he read it again. He set it face down on the table and reached for his tea. "Bad news?" McGonagall asked. "Administrative," he said pleasantly, and began discussing the upcoming Quidditch schedule with Flitwick, and if his hand wasn't entirely steady on the teacup, nobody mentioned it. But McGonagall had seen the Gringotts seal, and Minerva McGonagall, once she began examining something she'd been avoiding, was extremely thorough. The hearing was set for December 14th. Harry arrived at the Ministry of Magic for the first time in his life in the company of Phileas Crack and Ragnarok, and 2 other goblins whose titles he'd been given in a briefing scroll and whose names translated roughly as Senior Legal Officer and the one who carries the documents, which was exactly what the second one did, a satchel so full of parchment it had its own small trolley. Harry was wearing proper clothes for the first time in his memory, not Dudley's cast-offs but actual clothes, in his size, which had arrived via the same brown paper and letter slot system as the books. Dark trousers, a dark green jumper, boots that fit his feet entirely without newspaper in them. He'd combed his hair, which had immediately resumed its usual positions regardless, so he'd left it. He was 3 weeks past his 7th birthday. He walked through the ministry atrium the way Ragnar had told him to walk, with the scroll under his arm and his back straight, and without looking at the people who were looking at him. There would be a lot of looking. The goblin filing had gone through official channels, which meant ministry clerical staff had seen it, which meant, given that ministry clerical staff were human beings with their own interests and social lives, approximately half of Wizarding Britain knew that something involving the Potter estate and Gringotts was being heard before the Wizengamot today. The whispers started near the fountain. He heard his name in them. "That's Harry Potter. I think that's, is he actually? He's tiny," and he kept walking, because the whispers didn't change the filing and the filing was what mattered. They took a lift down. The Wizengamot chamber was in the lower levels, circular and tiered, and lined with members in their plum-colored robes taking their seats with the particular shuffling activity of people who knew something interesting was about to happen. The chamber smelled of old wood and old decisions, and the particular flavor of institutional authority that either intimidated you or didn't, and Harry had decided before he arrived that it didn't. The Potter seat was in the upper tier, 3rd from the left of the central aisle. Empty for 6 years. Ragnar had sent a formal notification of Harry's heir designation to the chamber clerk 2 weeks ago, which meant the seat was marked with the Potter crest in gold on the chairback, recognizing the heir-in-waiting's right to be present. Harry walked to it and sat down. He was small enough that when he sat properly, his feet came quite close to the floor without touching it, which was an improvement over Phileas Crack's office chair. He put the scroll on the armrest and his hands in his lap and waited. The chamber filled. He felt the eyes coming to him the way you feel weather coming, a change in atmospheric pressure, a prickling awareness. He didn't look around. He watched the central floor where the Chief Warlock's chair sat on its raised platform. Dumbledore arrived at 11 o'clock exactly. Harry had never seen him in person before. He was tall, taller than he seemed in photographs, which Harry had only seen in books, with silver hair and a silver beard and half-moon spectacles and robes the color of deep water. He moved the way people who are used to rooms turning toward them move, not quite performing, but not performing either. He took his chair at the central dais and arranged his robes and looked out over the chamber with the expression of a man who had presided over 1,000 hearings and expected this one to be manageable. Then he looked up at the Potter seat. Their eyes met across the chamber. Harry held the gaze without blinking, without shifting, without any change of expression whatsoever. He simply looked back the way you'd look at a sum you were working out. Something moved through Dumbledore's face, very fast, very controlled but real. Adjustment, recalculation. He had known Harry would be here. He'd had the notification, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. The boy in the Potter seat was not what he'd been building his plans around. The boy in the Potter seat was looking at him with eyes that weren't angry or frightened or awed. They were just watching. Dumbledore looked away first, which was not a thing he usually did, and called the session to order. The chamber clerk read the filing into the record. It took 11 minutes and the room got quieter and quieter as it went on. The estate grievance clause required that the full filing be read aloud, every item, every date, every reference number, which is why Ragnar had made sure the filing was thorough. Exhaustively, deliberately, legally thorough. When the 52 items were read one by one, Harry heard the chamber do what the man in the chair didn't: react, rustling. A sharply indrawn breath somewhere to his left. From the gallery above, where the press and public sat, a murmur that the chamber clerk didn't try to silence because there was nothing in the rules that said he had to. Item 1, Potter family pensive, solid silver, containing undisclosed number of preserved memories, registered as Potter family property in the Gringotts Central Registry since 1743. Item 14, James Fleamont Potter, personal correspondence file, including 16 sealed letters marked for future delivery to Harry James Potter. Item 27, Lily Juniper Potter, personal grimoire, handwritten, 847 pages, magically sealed to respond only to Potter bloodline. Item 39, deed of property, Godric's Hollow, including all improvements and magical wards, registered in the name of the Potter family in perpetuity. Item 52, one sealed letter addressed in the hand of James Fleamont Potter to Harry, when you're ready. Date of composition, October 28, 1981. 3 days before his parents died, the chamber was silent. Then Dumbledore spoke. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was exactly as it always was: measured, warm, avuncular. The voice of the grandfather of the wizarding world. "I would like to address this chamber directly, if I may, and explain the circumstances that led to these arrangements." He spoke for 20 minutes. Harry listened to all of it. It was good. He had to admit that it was genuinely good. Dumbledore spoke about the chaos of the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, the lack of family, the dangers still present from remaining Death Eaters, the critical need to protect not just Harry but everything Harry would one day inherit. He spoke about impossible choices made in impossible circumstances. He spoke about the estate being held in trust, always intended to be returned, safeguarded, because the wizarding world in November 1981 was not a safe place. He didn't say I was wrong, he was too careful for that, but he implied a version of "I understand how this appears," and he implied it with such warmth and such genuine-seeming sorrow that Harry watched two members of the Wizengamot nodding along, and that was worth noting. When Dumbledore finished, the chamber clerk looked to Harry. "The heir may address the chamber," the clerk said, and there was a note in his voice that suggested he was experiencing the slight professional vertigo of doing something unprecedented. Harry stood. The chamber's attention snapped to him with an almost physical weight. He was the smallest person in the room by some margin. His dark green jumper was tidy and his hands were at his sides, and he'd left the scroll on the chair because he didn't need it. "I have one question," Harry said. His voice was clear in the circular space, not loud, but it didn't need to be loud. Acoustic chambers were built to carry. For Headmaster Dumbledore. Dumbledore inclined his head with the graciousness of someone who had already written the answer to whatever was coming. "My father wrote me a letter," Harry said. "October 28, 1981, 3 days before he died." He paused. "My father's letter to me was taken on November 3rd. It has been in a box in Gringotts for 6 years. I have not read it." Another pause. Did my parents agree to any of this? The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of 43 people in plum-colored robes sitting very still, while something shifted in their understanding of what they were watching. Dumbledore looked at him across the chamber. "Your parents were gone, Harry," he said gently. "There was no way to." "There's a letter on item 14, Harry said, "in my father's hand, dated October 28th. He tilted his head slightly. "If my parents hadn't agreed to anything, he might have written down what he wanted instead. What he thought should happen to me and to our family's things." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "That letter has been in a box for 6 years. He let the silence hold for a moment. "If you were safeguarding my family's assets on my behalf, why didn't you read it? Why didn't you carry out whatever he asked?" Dumbledore opened his mouth, closed it. It was, Harry thought, the first time he'd seen the man not have a ready answer. It lasted only a second, then the warmth came back, the gravity, the performance of a man carrying more sorrow than anyone could know. "That letter was a deeply private." "Yes," Harry said. It was private." He looked around the chamber once, not performing the look but making it functional, letting every present member see his face while he said the next thing. "My father wrote his 7-year-old son a private letter 3 days before he was killed. That letter was taken from my family's vault 2 days after he died and has been sitting unopened in someone else's custody for 6 years. He turned back to Dumbledore. "What exactly were you protecting it from?" Nobody answered. Nobody in the chamber moved. Harry sat back down. Augusta Longbottom had been in the Wizengamot for 41 years. She had seen hearings go sideways before. She had caused hearings to go sideways before on several memorable occasions, but she had never seen anything quite like watching Albus Dumbledore sit in the Chief Warlock's chair and fail to answer a 7-year-old's question. She called for the formal charges to be entered during the procedural section. The estate grievance clause made it mandatory, but there was mandatory and then there was Augusta Longbottom calling for it. which were technically the same thing but felt different in the room. "The charges are entered," she said, from her seat in the lower tier, with the absolute authority of someone who had been using that voice since before most of the current membership was born. Violation of the Estate Protection Statutes of 1872, unauthorized removal of registered family property, failure to execute known final arrangements. She was looking at Dumbledore as she listed them. "To be formally investigated and returned before this chamber no later than the spring session." "Seconded," said a voice from across the chamber, and Harry located it, a wizard in his 50s with the bearing of someone from one of the old families, someone who hadn't particularly been a friend of Dumbledore's but had been politically careful about it. Not anymore, apparently. The vote to formally file the charges was 31 to 12. Harry noted who voted which way. He'd been given a seating chart by Ragnarok before the session. He memorized it during the clerk's reading. The 12 who'd voted against the charges got their names filed under Dumbledore's people in the architecture of his memory, and the 31 who'd voted for them got sorted more finely: true allies, reluctant pragmatists, and those who were simply looking for a change in the political weather and had just decided which way it was blowing. When the session was closed, Dumbledore stood, spoke a few gracious words about the importance of proper legal processes and the inviolability of family rights, and left the chamber without looking at Harry's seat again. Which told Harry more than looking at it would have. Augusta Longbottom was waiting for him in the corridor outside. She was exactly as Harry had expected from 6 weeks of reading about her: tall, imperious, the kind of woman who wore hats like they were weapons and meant it. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them bothered with a warm-up. "You managed that extremely well," she said. "I asked one question," Harry said. "The right question at the right moment is better than an hour of argument, and you're old enough to know that, which means you're either very gifted or very well coached." "Both," Harry said honestly. Something shifted in Augusta's expression that was close to approval. She looked at Phileas Crack, who had appeared at Harry's shoulder. "The items, the physical return, timeline, the charges being entered triggers the formal return process," Phileas Crack said. "We expect the items to begin transfer within the week." Augusta nodded sharp, then she looked back at Harry. "My grandson is starting Hogwarts in 4 years. He's a good boy, gentle. The school under the current administration is not always kind to boys who are gentle." She said this in the tone of someone having a completely unrelated conversation, which meant it was not unrelated at all. "I'll be starting in 4 years too," Harry said. "Yes," she looked at him steadily. "I suspect Hogwarts will be somewhat different by the time you get there." "I'm counting on it," Harry said. Something moved in her eyes that might, on a less fortified face, have been a smile. She touched the brim of her hat, not adjusting it, just the smallest acknowledgement, and turned and walked back toward the lifts with the stride of someone who had places to be. Harry watched her go. "She's been trying to unseat him from the Chief Warlock position for 8 years, Phileas Crack said quietly. "I know," Harry said. "She now has grounds." They were halfway to the lifts when the voice came from behind them, low, careful, private. The voice of someone who had chosen this moment and this corridor specifically. "Harry," he turned. Minerva McGonagall was standing 20 feet away in the corridor, in the Wisengamot Gallery exit, still in her visiting robes. She had come to the hearing, of course she had. They looked at each other. 3 months had passed since the pavement outside Gringotts, since he took 52 things and the color draining from her face. She looked different now, not recovered, exactly, but decided. The way people look when they've been chewing on something for a long time and have finally swallowed it. "You were right," she said, "about deciding where I stand." Harry waited. "I've been trying," she said, and there was a difficulty in it that she didn't try to cover because McGonagall was apparently the kind of person who didn't bother covering difficulties when the situation made them irrelevant, to understand when it began. "When I chose to," she stopped, chose a more honest word, "when I chose to not look at certain things." "Why are you telling me this?" Harry asked, not unkindly. "Because I owe you a debt," she said, "not legally. I didn't take anything from your family's vault, but she looked him in the eye and he respected her for the fact that she did, actually, make herself do it. "I knew you were with the Dursleys. I visited once the night you were brought there. I told Dumbledore I thought it was wrong," she paused, "and then I let it go. Because he said you'd be safe, and it seemed important, and there were 100 other things that needed doing." She stopped. "That's what we all told ourselves, 100 other things that needed doing." Harry listened to all of it. Then he said, "Did you know about the vault?" "No." "Did you know about the letter?" "No." Her voice was very quiet now. "I didn't know about any of the specific things. I just knew that you were in a house where you weren't wanted, and I decided that Albus's judgment was more reliable than my own discomfort. That was my choice." Harry thought about this, about the distinction between actively taking 52 things and standing back while someone else did. They were not the same crime, they were not the same character, but they shared a precondition, the decision to trust one person's judgment over your own sense of what was wrong. The hearing, he said. You were in the gallery. Yes, the charges passed 31-12. I know. I was watching. She met his eyes again. Your question, did my parents agree to any of this? She stopped. I don't know why I didn't think to ask it myself, years ago, because you trusted him, Harry said. Not cruel, not forgiving, just accurate. McGonagall looked away for a moment, out the narrow corridor window at the grey winter sky. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, Harry said, but I might in 4 years. 4 years, she repeated, understanding the weight of it, when he arrived at Hogwarts, when the school itself became the territory. He's still headmaster, Harry said. The charges are filed, but he's not removed. He'll still be there when I arrive. He looked at her with the same level steadiness he'd used across the chamber. When that time comes, it would be useful to have someone inside the school who has already decided. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was nearly empty now. The other hearing attendees had mostly moved on to the lifts or back to the gallery exit. It was just the two of them and the grey sky, and the weight of what had been laid on the table today. I'll be there, she said. Harry nodded. He turned back toward the lift, then he paused. You were at Godric's Hollow, he said. That night you watched the house all day. He'd read it somewhere in one of the law books in a report filed by a ministry observer. You were there before Dumbledore arrived with me, before Hagrid took me. He looked back at her. So you saw the house, you saw what it looked like, you spent the day there. McGonagall's face had gone very still. My parents had a house, Harry said, and there was something in his voice now that was the very distant sound of grief, several layers down, controlled but not absent. The deed is item 39. It's in a box in Gringotts. When it comes back, I want to know if the house can be restored. Under Goblin estate law, Phileas Crack said quietly, the deed's return triggers the automatic restoration of… I know, Harry said. I've read about it. He looked at McGonagall again. I just thought you should know since you were there. He walked to the lift and pressed the button and didn't look back, and Phileas Crack followed him, and the door closed, and he rode up through the layers of the ministry in silence with his hands in his pockets and the scroll under his arm and the Gringotts coin warm against his chest. He didn't cry on the tube home. He didn't cry when he slipped back through the kitchen window. He didn't cry when Petunia gave him half a sandwich without looking at him and went back to watching television. He sat in his cupboard and took out the seating chart from the hearing, which he'd folded carefully into his pocket, and went through the names one more time. Allies, pragmatists, Dumbledore's people. He made the distinctions cleanly. He filed everything where it belonged. Then he took out a sheet of paper, actual paper, from the school exercise book Petunia bought him without comment, and wrote at the top, items to be returned, priority order. He put the letter from his father at number 1. He put his mother's grimoire at number 2. He put the pensive at number 3. Then he sat for a long time looking at the list, at the 3 things that had been taken from him before he had language for what they were, and he thought about the fact that they were coming back. That the machinery he'd set in motion on a Tuesday 3 months ago was actually working, moving through its procedures, bearing down on a 600-year-old legal mechanism toward an outcome that everyone who'd been comfortable had assumed would never arrive. He was 7 years old. He had 4 years before Hogwarts. He thought about what his mother's handwriting might look like. He thought about whether his father's letter would explain things or ask things or both. He thought about the pensive and what was in it, and saved that particular thought for later because it felt larger than tonight. Gerald had come with him somehow, or a Gerald, a new one, in the corner of the cupboard ceiling near the ventilation crack. Spinning the same patient circles. Good day, Harry told him, and meant it. Outside, winter was settling into the street with its grey and its bare trees and its particular smell of coal smoke and cold earth. Somewhere beneath the ordinary surface of the world, 31 Wisengamot members had just formally charged Albus Dumbledore with violations of estate law. An ancient legal clock had been wound and was ticking. A woman who had stood back for 6 years was standing forward now, or beginning to, which was the harder direction to go. And in a sealed holding chamber deep in Gringotts, 52 items were waiting to come home. Chapter 3. What the Potters left behind. The first item came back on a Wednesday, not the letter, not the grimoire. Not any of the 52, actually. What came back first was a notification, hand-delivered by a Gringotts courier to the Privet Drive letter slot at 7 in the morning, informing Harry James Potter, heir apparent of the most ancient house of Potter, that the formal transfer process had been initiated and that items would be returned in the order specified by his priority list. The letter was at the top of his priority list. It arrived on Thursday. Harry was eating toast when it came, brown paper again, thin, unremarkable. He picked it up from the mat before Petunia could and went to his cupboard and sat on the edge of his cot and held it in his lap for a while without opening it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more like the feeling before you open a door you've been standing outside for a long time. The room is the same room it's always been. You know that. But it's still different once you've opened the door than it was while you were outside it, and you can't go back to outside it afterward, and that's worth sitting with for a moment before you turn the handle. The envelope was cream-colored, slightly yellowed with 6 years of storage, sealed with plain wax in the shape of a stag. His name on the front in writing he'd never seen before but recognized immediately, the particular way a person writes the name of someone they love, with a little extra space around it, like you want the letters to have room to breathe. "Harry, when you're ready," he opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. Harry read it twice, the first time fast and the second time slowly, and between the 2 readings he sat very still with the pages in his lap and the early morning quiet of the house around him, Dudley still asleep, Vernon's car already gone, Petunia moving in the kitchen above with the particular measured footsteps of someone who was deliberately not coming downstairs. His father wrote the way Harry had somehow imagined he would, direct, a little impatient with his own sentimentality, making jokes at the wrong moments, and then apologizing for them in parentheses. The letter was dated October 28, 1981, and it began, "Harry, if you're reading this, then things have gone wrong in some way I was trying to prevent, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry in advance for whatever it was. Your mother says I shouldn't apologize for things I couldn't control, and she's right, but I'm going to anyway, because that's the kind of father I am, and I think by the time you read this you'll know that about me." He wrote about the war briefly and without melodrama, Death Eaters, a prophecy, the specific shape of the danger that had been closing in on them through the autumn of 1981. He wrote about the charm they'd placed on the house and the secret keeper arrangement, and why of all people they'd chosen Peter Pettigrew. "We trusted him, completely. That may turn out to be the worst decision I ever made, and if it does, I want you to know it wasn't carelessness. It was love, which is sometimes the same as carelessness, but the intentions were different. We trusted him because he'd been our friend for 20 years, and because Sirius suggested it, and because sometimes love makes you believe things will be fine, because you need them to be fine. If Peter has done something wrong, if that's part of how things went badly, I want you to know that Sirius didn't know. He'll seem like the obvious suspect and he won't be, and nobody will believe that, and I'm sorry I can't fix that from wherever I am." Harry stopped here and read the paragraph again and then a third time, Peter Pettigrew, secret keeper. The specific, careful way his father had written it, if Peter has done something wrong, like a man laying out evidence for a court case rather than a man accusing a friend. Because James Potter had been clearly exactly the kind of person who prepared for everything, who registered blood claims at births and wrote letters in advance to children he hoped would never need them, and filed the paranoid paperwork that nobody else bothered with, because some part of him had understood that in a war you document everything and you do it clearly and you do it early. The letter went on, instructions about the vaults, about the family properties, about the Potter lordship and who the trusted people were and which solicitor to contact. Instructions about the pensive, there are memories in it that I wanted you to have, things about our family, about your history, but also a few things I've been keeping that might matter later. The one labeled PM, be careful with that one, it's important, I'm not sure yet how important but I'm keeping it just in case, PM. Harry filed that without blinking and kept reading. The last page was different from the others. The handwriting changed slightly, the same hand but slower, the kind of slower that happens when you stop writing practically and start writing from somewhere else. I don't know what you're like, by the time you read this you could be any age, any kind of person. You could be nothing like me. You could be exactly like your mother, which would be a better outcome honestly. She's smarter and kinder, and considerably less likely to jump off things for no reason. But I hope you got a bit of both of us. I hope you got her instincts, and whatever it is I have that makes me very difficult to frighten. I hope you're all right. I hope wherever you are, you're warm and you're fed and you have people around you who are paying attention. If you're not, if none of that is true, I want you to know that was never what we wanted for you. Whatever happened, whatever choices were made after us, the thing we wanted for you was simple, your own life. Not a role, not a purpose, not a piece in someone else's plan. Yours, we loved you from the start. Before the start, actually, the night we found out about you, your mother cried and I pretended not to and then cried in the bathroom later, which she knew about and was decent enough not to mention. Be careful, be brave. Eat your vegetables, which I say not because I particularly cared about vegetables, but because it seems like the sort of thing a father should say. I love you, Dad. Harry sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. He wasn't going to cry. He decided he wasn't going to cry, not because crying was wrong. He understood intellectually that it was not wrong, but because there was a feeling in his chest that was too large for crying, that crying would somehow make smaller than it actually was. So he sat with it instead and let it be large and let it be real, and let his father's handwriting be on actual paper in his actual hands, here now, 6 years late and entirely on time. Then he folded the letter carefully, exactly along its original creases, put it back in the envelope and placed it under his mattress with the scroll. He ate his toast cold in the kitchen and went to school and got a perfectly average mark on his spelling test and came home and waited for the next item. His mother's grimoire arrived on Saturday. It was heavier than a book had any right to be, and it pulsed faintly under his hands, a warmth that recognized him before he recognized it. The cover was dark green leather worn soft with use, filled with 847 pages of his mother's handwriting, and his mother's handwriting, Harry discovered immediately, was nothing like his father's. Where James Potter wrote like someone in a hurry to get to the next thing, Lily Potter wrote with the careful, curious precision of someone who was documenting a process she found genuinely fascinating and wanted to get exactly right. She'd started the grimoire at 16 and never stopped. The early pages were schoolwork, spells annotated with this modification works better, tested 11-476 and standard incantation is inefficient, see page 43 for improved approach. Harry turned pages slowly, reading fragments, watching his mother at 16, 17, 18, growing through the evidence of her thinking, the marginalia getting more complex as the years went on. She'd invented things. That was the part that stopped him, not modified, not improved, invented. New spells worked out from first principles with the same logical structure as mathematical proofs, each step annotated with why it worked rather than just that it did. Some of them Harry had never heard of. Some of them solved problems that he'd read about in his borrowed magical theory books as currently unsolvable. He spent all of Saturday with it. He barely noticed lunch. On page 312 there was a section titled simply, Blood Magic Protective Applications. His mother had written at the top, working theory following the Ravencroft papers, sacrificial protection, voluntary death, love as a binding magical force, not tested, obviously. She'd written it in 1980, a year before Halloween. She'd been working out the theory of what she would eventually do, understanding the mechanism before she had reason to apply it, the way mathematicians prove theorems for the pleasure of the proof before the application shows up. She had known. Not exactly, not with dates and names, but she had understood the shape of the protection she might one day need to make, and she had worked it out in full, and when the moment came she had walked into it with open eyes. Harry put his hand flat on the page and felt the warmth of the book against his palm. "Hi, Mum," he said, to the empty cupboard, to Gerald in his corner, to the particular quality of Saturday afternoon light coming through the ventilation crack. Then he turned to page 313 and kept reading. The pensive came on Monday after school. It arrived in a box that was considerably larger than the letter slot should have allowed, which meant it had come by a different route. Harry found it on his cot when he opened the cupboard, and there was something deeply unbothered about the way Gringotts logistics operated that he appreciated. He'd stopped questioning the magic a while ago. It worked, that was enough. The pensive was silver, exactly as the registry had described, with a shallow basin about the size of a large soup bowl and runes carved around the rim that Harry recognized from his mother's grimoire, the same script, the same hand. She'd made this or had it made or had added to an older one. Something about it was hers in the way the grimoire was hers. The memories were stored in small vials, each one labeled in his father's handwriting, nestled in a fitted box inside the basin. Harry counted them, 19 in total. Family memories mostly. The labels said things like Christmas 1979 and Fleamont's Garden, Summer 77 and Lily's first time flying, her choice not mine. Harry picked that one up and looked at it and put it back down gently because it was the kind of thing you needed to be ready for, and he wasn't ready for it yet. Then he found the one labeled PM. It was near the back of the box, physically separated from the others by a small piece of folded card. Harry picked it up. The memory inside the vial had a different quality from the others, darker, less warm, the silvery light that moved through it more dense, like weather rather than daylight. Be careful with that one, his father had written. It's important. I'm not sure yet how important. Harry turned it in his fingers for a long moment. He was in a cupboard under stairs in Surrey, and this was a memory stored in a vial, and he had no idea how to operate a pensive. He'd read about them, but reading about them and using one were different things. And his father had said be careful, and James Potter had apparently been extremely careful about everything, which meant that whatever was in this vial warranted actual respect. He tucked it back into the box, set the pensive carefully under the cot and went to Gringotts. Phileas Crack showed him how to use it. They used a pensive room in the lower levels of Gringotts, a stone room with nothing in it but a table and a pensive stand and light that came from the walls themselves, warm and unwavering. Harry set his father's pensive on the stand and Phileas Crack showed him how to transfer a memory from vial to basin and how to lean in and go under. The first time Harry leaned into a pensive, he understood immediately why his father had said be careful. It wasn't like watching a film, it wasn't like remembering something. It was like being inside the moment while remaining entirely yourself. You could move through the scene, look at faces, stand anywhere you chose, and nothing could see you or speak to you, and that was the part that made it merciless, because you were completely present in a moment you couldn't change. He did the Christmas 1979 memory first, not PM, not yet, but something that would tell him what it felt like to see them. He stood in a bright kitchen and watched his father make toast while arguing cheerfully about something with his mother across the table, and she was laughing, and there was a moment where James Potter pointed the butter knife at her to make a point, and she pointed her wand at him without looking up from her book, and the knife levitated itself back to the plate, and his father grinned at her with the specific grin of someone delighted by the person they married. Harry stood in the kitchen for the full length of the memory and didn't look away from a single second of it. Then he came back up, sat down on the stone floor with his back against the table leg, and stared at the ceiling. Phileas Crack said nothing. He stood in the corner with his hands folded and let Harry have the ceiling for as long as he needed. After a while, Harry stood up. "I'm going to do PM," he said. "Shall I remain?" Harry thought about it. "Yes," he said. "I might need to do something quickly after." He unstoppered the vial labeled PM and tipped it into the basin and leaned in. The memory was his father's. James Potter, 30 years old, the age he would stay forever, was standing in a lane near Hogsmeade in thin November rain. The date in the corner of the memory, in the way memories sometimes carried metadata their owner had deliberately attached, read October 14th, 1981. 2.5 weeks before Halloween, he was waiting for someone. That was clear from the way he stood, hood up, hands in pockets, the studied casualness of a man trying not to look like he was waiting. The lane was empty of anyone else. Then footsteps, and Albus Dumbledore came around the corner. Harry, standing invisible in the memory rain, watched his father and Dumbledore stand 10 feet apart in a lane in October 1981, and understood immediately that this was not a friendly meeting. His father's face had closed in a way the Christmas memory had not prepared him for, not angry, but guarded, which was worse. James Potter guarding himself against someone was the specific warning posture of a man who had decided he couldn't trust them, but hadn't decided yet what to do about it. "You changed the plan," his father said, no greeting, no preamble. "The original arrangement had risks," Dumbledore began. "You changed it without telling us," James said. "We agreed on Sirius, we planned around Sirius. You went to Peter and made the switch, and then you told us it was already done." His voice was completely level, which was clearly harder than raising it would have been. "Why?" Dumbledore looked at him with that warm, grave expression. "Sirius is too obvious a choice. If Voldemort goes looking, Sirius would die before he told anyone." "Yes, he would. And then he would be dead and we would have lost a valuable." "He is not valuable," James said, and the levelness cracked for just a moment, hot underneath. "He's my best friend, he's not a resource." Dumbledore was quiet for a beat, which was the beat of someone choosing their next sentence with precision. "The switch was necessary. Peter is less likely to be targeted. The logic is sound." "The logic," James looked at him. "You've been doing a lot of that lately. Logic, the greater good. The necessary choices." He pushed his hood back despite the rain. "I've been watching how you operate, Albus, how you move people around. Sirius noticed it too. You don't tell people the whole plan, you tell them the piece of the plan you need them to act on, and then you manage the rest separately, and you trust your own judgment about which piece goes where." He paused. "And you're usually right, I know that, that's the problem." Dumbledore waited. "When you're usually right," James said quietly, "nobody asks you the times you're wrong, they just trust you because you've been right before." He was looking at Dumbledore with something that was not quite accusation and not quite sorrow but lived between them. "If something happens to us, if Peter does something wrong, if any of this goes wrong, Sirius will take the blame. You know that, because you made him the obvious choice and then took him out of the actual role so he looks guilty without being guilty." "Nothing is going to, if it does," James said. "I need to know you'll fix it. I need to know that if Peter fails, if Sirius ends up blamed for something he didn't do, you'll tell the truth." He was looking directly at Dumbledore now, and Harry, standing invisible in the rain, understood why his father had preserved this memory, just in case. "Because James Potter documented everything. Tell me you'll fix it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the silence was itself an answer. "I will do what is necessary," he said, "for the greater good of the wizarding world." Which was not what James had asked. James looked at him, and the hope Harry hadn't realized he'd been watching for in his father's face, the hope that this conversation would end differently than his father had expected when he'd arranged it, quietly closed like a door. "Right," James said. And that was all. He turned up his collar against the rain and walked back down the lane the way he'd come, and Dumbledore stood watching him go, and the memory ended. Harry came up out of the pensive and stood in the Gringotts stone room and was very still for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Phileas Crack. "Peter Pettigrew was their secret keeper," Harry said, "not Sirius Black." Dumbledore arranged the switch without telling them properly. And Dumbledore knew when everything happened, when Sirius was blamed, he knew Sirius wasn't the secret keeper. He kept his voice entirely flat, not because he wasn't feeling things, but because the things he was feeling were too operational to allow expression right now. "Sirius Black is in Azkaban." Phileas Crack was very still. "Yes, for something he didn't do. If the memory is accurate, my father preserved it," Harry said. Deliberately, he labeled it PM, Peter and Pettigrew, not Pettigrew's initials, Peter and the memory. He saved it as evidence. He looked at the pensive. "Pettigrew is listed in the records as dead, killed by Sirius, but Dumbledore knew Pettigrew was the secret keeper and he let Sirius take the blame and go to Azkaban anyway." The flatness in his voice had a temperature to it now, very cold, very precise. Because Sirius in Azkaban couldn't ask questions, couldn't challenge anything, couldn't show up and start looking at what happened to my parents' vault, Phileas Crack moved to the table and sat down slowly. This was, Harry noted, the first time he'd seen the old goblin need to sit. "I need copies of this memory," Harry said. "As many as the pensive can produce. I need them sent simultaneously." He thought about his father's letter. "Nobody will believe it. I can't fix that from wherever I am." He thought about 31 Wizengamot members who had just voted to file charges. He thought about Augusta Longbottom, who had been fighting Dumbledore's entrenched power for 8 years and was now holding ammunition she hadn't had yesterday. Every sitting Wizengamot member, every major wizarding newspaper, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the head of the DMLE directly by personal courier marked urgent. He looked at Phileas Crack. "Can you do that today? Memory duplication requires." "Can you do it today?" Phileas Crack met his eyes. "Yes, then let's do it today." They spent 3 hours on the logistics. Gringotts had memory duplication equipment in the lower levels, old, specialized, the kind of thing that existed because the bank had been preserving important evidence for centuries and had long since worked out the infrastructure for doing it properly. 19 copies of the PM memory were produced, each in its own labeled vial with a sealed verification document from Gringotts attesting to the memory's provenance and chain of custody. James Potter, recorded and sealed before his death, transferred to Gringotts upon the return of the family pensive, copied under authenticated conditions. The verification document mattered more than the memory itself, almost. Anyone could claim to have a memory. The Gringotts seal on a chain of custody document was a different category of evidence entirely. Ragnok appeared halfway through the process, which meant Phileas Crack had told him what was happening, which meant Ragnok had decided he wanted to be present for the next part. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at the copies being prepared and at Harry and said, "You understand what this triggers?" "Yes," Harry said, "not just legally, publicly, yes." Dumbledore's support in the Wizengamot comes partly from old loyalty and partly from the belief that he is the most capable protector the wizarding world has. Ragnok's voice was careful without being soft. "This calls that into direct question, not just the estate violations, those are serious but they can be explained. This is a man in Azkaban for something he didn't do, and the most trusted person in the wizarding world knew and said nothing." "I know," Harry said, "the public reaction will be, Ragnok." Harry looked at him directly. "I know, I've thought about it." He picked up one of the sealed vials and turned it in his fingers. "Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 6 years, for something he didn't do, while Pettigrew is alive somewhere and Dumbledore knew the truth and filed it away the same way he filed my parents' vault." He set the vial back down. "I'm not interested in managing the public reaction, I'm interested in getting it right." Ragnok looked at him for a long moment, then he said to Phileas Crack, "Send them." The reaction was not gradual. Wizarding Britain did not have the internet, but it had something almost faster. The interconnected social machinery of a small community where everyone knew everyone and news traveled through flu calls and owl post, and the daily prophet with the velocity of something people had been half expecting and hadn't known they were half expecting until it arrived. The Daily Prophet ran it on the front page the next morning. WIZNGMOT receives memory evidence in black case. PETTIGIW named true traitor. GINGOTTS confirms provenance. Below the fold, Dumbledore knew sources claim. Harry read it at the kitchen table with his toast and a glass of orange juice, and then he went to school and got a perfectly average mark on his arithmetic test. He heard later, through Phileas Crack, who was surprisingly well connected for someone who mostly sat in a room full of ledgers, how the rest of it went. How the DMLE opened an emergency case file within 4 hours of receiving the memory. How Augusta Longbottom stood in the Wizengamot chamber that afternoon and moved an emergency motion for a review of Sirius Black's imprisonment, citing the Gringotts verified memory evidence as grounds for immediate action. How the motion passed in 20 minutes, which was approximately 19 minutes faster than emergency motions usually passed. How Dumbledore stood to speak and found, for the second time in a fortnight, that his usual confidence had a fracture running through it that hadn't been there before. Harry wasn't present for that session. He was at school doing arithmetic, but he thought about it on the tube home. Sirius Black, who his father had said would die before he told anyone and who had spent 6 years in Azkaban for something he didn't do, and who was now, because of a Tuesday in September and a dream about a number and an old goblin willing to act on a 60-year-old accord, about to have a case reopened. He thought about the Christmas kitchen, his father pointing a butter knife, his mother not looking up from her book while she returned it with magic, precise and casual. He thought about what it meant to have people. To have actually had them once. The tube rattled through its tunnel and Harry held the coin against his chest, warm in his palm. McGonagall came to Gringotts 4 days later. Harry had been expecting an owl, a letter, some formal communication. He had not been expecting her to simply appear in the waiting area of the bank on a Saturday morning in her ordinary coat, Not her robes, her actual coat, grey wool, the coat of a woman who had decided this was a personal visit and not a professional one. The door guard brought the message to Phileas Crack's office, where Harry was working through a stack of correspondence related to the estate, and Harry read the message. Professor McGonagall requests to speak with Harry Potter, says she will wait, and thought about it for 30 seconds and said, "Send her down." She came into the office and looked at the stack of correspondence and the annotated seating chart on the table and Harry sitting in the chair with his feet almost reaching the floor, and something moved through her face that was not quite the thing from the Wisengamot corridor but was related to it. "Sit down," Harry said. She sat. "Sirius Black," Harry said, not making it a question. "The emergency review hearing is in 2 weeks," she said. "He'll be brought from Azkaban for a full Wisengamot session." With the memory evidence and the Gringotts provenance documentation, she stopped. "They'll release him, I'm nearly certain of it." Harry nodded. "He'll need somewhere to go," McGonagall said carefully. "He's been in Azkaban for 6 years." "He won't be," she chose her words. "He'll need time and support. And eventually, if he's willing, he is your godfather and there are legal implications too." "I know," Harry said. He'd read about godfather law the week before, in anticipation of exactly this. "I've already asked Phileas Crack to prepare the relevant filings." McGonagall looked at him, not for once with that particular expression that people gave him when they were recalibrating around a 7-year-old who talked about legal filings. She looked at him with something simpler. "How are you?" she asked. Harry looked up from the correspondence. The question landed differently than he'd expected. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "I read my dad's letter," he said. She was quiet. "He was funny," Harry said. "In it, he made jokes and then apologized for them." He looked back at the papers. "He told me to eat my vegetables." McGonagall was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had none of the formal architecture she usually built around herself. "He absolutely never ate his vegetables," she said. "Not once in 7 years of school dinners." Harry looked at her. "He used to vanish them," she said. "He thought I didn't know, I always knew." She stopped, looked at the wall. "He once transfigured his broccoli into a perfect replica of his broccoli, down to the color and texture, and sat there smiling at me while I walked past, and it took me until the following Tuesday to work out what he'd done." Something in her face was doing the thing that wasn't quite a smile. "He was insufferably good at transfiguration." Harry sat with that for a moment. His father, 17 years old, grinning at a younger McGonagall over a fake broccoli, filing it away. "My mother's grimoire," Harry said. She worked out the theoretical basis for the protective charm she used, a year before she needed it, from first principles. He looked at McGonagall. "Was she always like that?" "She came to magic at 11 and outpaced people who'd grown up in it within 2 years, McGonagall said. "Not because she worked harder, though she did, but because she wanted to understand why. Most students want to know how a spell works. Lily wanted to know why it was possible at all." She paused. She made Dumbledore uncomfortable once in a staff meeting. She'd sent him an essay, voluntary, not for a class, about theoretical errors in the standard model of Patronus casting. He was gracious about it, but I was watching him and he wasn't entirely comfortable. A pause. She was 17. Harry thought about the grimoire's 847 pages about blood magic protective applications, about the theoretical proof laid out a year in advance. "She was smarter than him," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him. Then quietly, "In certain ways, yes, I think so." Harry nodded and went back to his correspondence. McGonagall sat for a moment longer, watching him work through the papers, answering letters from Wisengamot members, annotating the seating chart, making notes in the margin in a handwriting that was, she noticed with a start, a mixture of both his parents. His father's speed and his mother's precision, somehow occupying the same letters. "The house," she said finally. "Godric's Hollow, you asked about it." "The deed was returned with the first batch," Harry said without looking up. "The Goblin estate law triggers automatic restoration of the property once the deed is in the heir's hands. Ragnarok says it should be complete within the month." He did look up now. "I'm not going to live there, not yet, but I want it to be," he thought about the word, "ready when I need it." "Of course," McGonagall said. She seemed like she might say something else, something personal, something about the night she'd spent watching the house. She didn't. Harry appreciated that. There were things that didn't need to be said yet, and she seemed to understand which ones they were. She stood to leave. At the door she turned back. "Dumbledore is not whatever else he is not finished," she said. "The charges, the memory evidence, losing his position as Chief Warlock, which the emergency vote last week." She paused at Harry's expression. "You didn't hear about that?" "I was at school," Harry said. "Augusta Longbottom moved an emergency vote of no confidence in the Chief Warlock position yesterday afternoon," McGonagall said. "Carried 37 to 8. A pause. "He's no longer Chief Warlock." Harry held that for a moment. "But still headmaster." "Yes. The school is, the Hogwarts board is separate from the Wisengamot. Removing him from the school would require the governors to act. And most of the governors are either Dumbledore's allies or afraid of the parents who are," Harry said. "I know," he thought about it. 4 years. McGonagall looked at him. 4 years, he said again. That's the timeline, that's when I arrive. And everything that needs to shift before then will shift before then, and the things that don't shift, he looked at her steadily, will encounter me in person, and that'll be different. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was several things at once: respect and concern, and something that was a little like the look she'd had in Dumbledore's staff meeting when Lily Potter had handed him an essay that made him uncomfortable. Pride in something she hadn't taught and wasn't sure she could take credit for. Don't get arrogant, she said, because she was McGonagall and that was the most caring thing she knew how to say. I'm not arrogant, Harry said. I just know what I'm doing. She left and Harry went back to his correspondence. The last event of that month happened on a Saturday evening. Phileas Crack sent a message. The restoration of the Godric's Hollow property is complete. If you wish to visit before Monday's survey, this evening is suitable. Harry put on his coat, his own coat, properly fitting dark grey, arrived via brown paper last week, and held the coin and thought not of Phileas Crack's office but of the address on the deed. He'd read it enough times to know it by heart. He arrived at the edge of the village at dusk. Godric's Hollow was small and still and smelled of autumn, wood smoke and cold earth, and the distant sound of a church bell doing something routine and unhurried. He walked through it without being seen or without being noticed, which might have been magic and might have been 7 years of practice at moving through spaces where you weren't supposed to exist. The house was at the end of a lane set back from it behind a low garden wall. It had been restored. The damage from 1981 was gone, the structure sound, the windows whole, the roof intact. But it hadn't been cleaned up, made generic, made into just a house. The garden still had the specific personality of people who had lived in it, the particular way someone had laid the flagstones, the rosebush that was late in the season but still had 2 red flowers on it, with the stubborn cheerfulness of something that grew the way it grew regardless. Harry pushed open the gate and walked up the path. He didn't go inside. He wasn't ready to go inside yet, and he understood himself well enough to know that. But he stood on the path and looked at the front door, dark wood, familiar in the way things are familiar when you've always known them somewhere below language, and put his hand on the gate post. The house was warm under his palm, not like the stone plate in Gringotts, not like the coin, warmer than those, the warmth of something that has been a home and remembers it. He stood there until the last of the light went out of the sky and the village settled into its evening quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just let the house know he was there and let himself know it was real. His parents' hands on these stones, his mother's garden, his father's door, everything that had been taken and everything that was being returned. The slow, patient work of a 7-year-old who had gotten on the tube with £1.40 and asked the right question. Behind him, up the lane, someone had lit a lamp in a window. The light fell warm on the frost beginning to form on the cobblestones, and the 2 red flowers on the rosebush held their colour in the dark. When he turned to walk back to the village and the coin and the journey home, he didn't feel like someone who had ended something. He felt like someone who had found the beginning of something that had always been there, waiting. 4 years until Hogwarts. 4 years was enough time. He'd done considerable work with considerably less. He walked back through Godric's Hollow with his hands in his pockets and his mother's warmth at his back and his father's nerve in the set of his shoulders and his own particular bright, dangerous mind running through everything that still needed doing, cataloguing, planning, filing away. Peter Pettigrew was alive somewhere. That was a thread not yet finished. Sirius Black would be free within the month. That was a thread just beginning. Dumbledore was no longer Chief Warlock but was still Headmaster, still powerful, still the kind of person who believed the world could be managed back into the shape he needed it. That was a thread with 4 years left to run, and Harry intended to be at the other end of it when it did. His mother's grimoire was at home under his mattress, next to his father's letter. 847 pages of a woman who wanted to understand not just how but why. He had 4 years to read every word. He thought that was a good use of 4 years. The coin was warm against his chest, and the night air was cold and clean, and ahead of him, the lane curved back toward the ordinary world, and Harry walked through it without hurrying because he didn't need to hurry. He had everything he needed, and he knew what he was doing, and the rest was just time.